Unlike the massive Zweihänder that announced its deadly purpose with every swing, the man-catcher operated on a principle of cruel efficiency. The basic design consisted of a long pole topped with a hinged metal collar lined with inward-facing spikes or barbs. When placed around an opponent's neck or limb and closed, these spikes prevented escape without causing immediate fatal injuries. Medieval engineers had essentially created a portable, instant prison cell on a stick, proof that catch and release was never part of the medieval combat philosophy. The economics of medieval warfare made the man-catcher an extremely practical tool. Knights and nobles represented significant financial investments, both in their equipment and in their potential ransom value. A dead knight yielded only his armor and weapons as spoils. A captured knight, however, could bring a fortune in ransom money. Historical records show ransoms reaching astronomical sums, with some high-ranking nobles commanding payments equivalent to several years' worth of a town's tax revenue. One particularly valuable French noble captured during the Hundred Years' War was ransomed for the modern equivalent of $6 million. Medieval accountants had figured out something important. Dead knights were a one-time transaction, but live ones were recurring revenue streams. Operating a man-catcher required less strength than weapons like the warhammer or Zweihänder, but demanded precise timing and positioning. Users were trained to target mounted opponents, using the long reach of the pole to snare a knight's neck or limb and then twist to unseat them from their horse. Once on the ground, an armored knight became surprisingly vulnerable, weighted down by the very equipment meant to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on medieval soldiers. Nothing says, "Your protection has become your prison," quite like watching a nobleman waddle helplessly in his own custom-fitted metal cage. The weapon proved particularly effective against helmet designs that protected the face but restricted peripheral vision, allowing man-catcher wielders to approach from angles their targets couldn't easily monitor. For all the elaborate engineering of medieval headgear, someone forgot the simple check your blind spots feature that might have prevented many a knight from becoming an unwilling participant in medieval catch and carry. Regional variations reflected different tactical needs. Germanic versions typically featured longer poles for safely reaching mounted opponents, while Mediterranean variants incorporated elaborate catching mechanisms, including spring-loaded components. Some advanced designs included secondary mechanisms that could tighten the collar further after initial capture, ensuring that struggling only increased the prisoner's discomfort. Medieval weaponsmiths had effectively invented the quit struggling or it gets worse principle long before modern restraint technology. Using man-catchers required specialized team tactics rather than individual prowess. Military manuscripts describe formations of 3 to 5 soldiers working together to capture high-value targets. One soldier would manage the man-catcher itself, while others provided protection and helped secure the prisoner once captured. These capture teams became highly valued units within medieval armies, receiving bonus payments for successfully taking important enemies alive. They were the medieval equivalent of repo men, except instead of taking your cart for missed payments, they took you for missed battlefield victories. The weapon found particular favor among forces tasked with urban security and riot control. City watch units from Venice to London maintained man-catchers as standard equipment for apprehending criminals in crowded streets. Their ability to control an opponent without necessarily causing fatal injuries made them ideal for situations where indiscriminate killing might spark broader unrest. Medieval catch-and-release programs had a very different meaning than today's fishing regulations. Nobles attempting to avoid capture developed specific countermeasures against man-catchers. Some knight orders modified their armor to include reinforced collars that prevented the weapon from gaining purchase around the neck. Others trained specifically to recognize and counter man-catcher wielders on the battlefield, targeting them as priority threats. Nothing motivated innovation quite like the prospect of being paraded home in a neck collar while your family sold the summer castle to pay your ransom. Unlike many medieval weapons that became obsolete with the advent of firearms, man-catchers maintained practical utility even as battlefield technology evolved. Their ability to control opponents at a distance without killing them fulfilled a need that guns could not. Modified versions appeared in law enforcement contexts well into the 19th century, particularly in regions where controlling suspects without firearms remained a priority. When your weapon doubled as an ATM withdrawal tool for enemy noblemen, you made sure to keep it in good working order. As we shift from the careful restraint of the man-catcher to our next weapon, we enter the realm of medieval combat where mercy was never part of the design specifications. The Morning Star represented medieval brutality distilled into its purest form, a heavy metal ball covered in spikes designed to deliver catastrophic damage with every strike. If nightmares could be forged in iron, they'd look exactly like this. The name Morning Star comes from the weapon's visual resemblance to the planet Venus. The bright morning star, when fitted with its characteristic metal spikes radiating outward from the central core. The poetic name stands in stark contrast to its decidedly unpoetic function on the battlefield. Medieval warriors had a peculiar talent for giving beautiful names to absolutely horrifying weapons. This particular star didn't grant wishes so much as ensure your enemies wouldn't be making any more of their own. Unlike its cousin the flail, the Morning Star had no chain connecting the striking head to the handle. This direct attachment made it far more reliable and easier to control in the chaos of combat, turning your average nightmare into a precision-guided bad dream. A typical Morning Star consisted of three main components: a wooden shaft for gripping, a metal mounting system, and the spiked striking head. This head could range from a relatively modest 3-inch diameter with half-inch spikes to massive versions spanning 6 inches across with spikes extending 2 to 3 inches from the surface. The largest specimens recovered from European battlefields weigh upwards of 10 pounds, heavy enough to shatter bones even without the added trauma of the spikes. When your weapon is essentially a medieval porcupine on a stick, subtlety was never going to be part of the design philosophy. The physics behind the Morning Star made it devastatingly effective against armored opponents. The weapon concentrated tremendous force into the small contact points represented by each spike tip. When swung against plate armor, these spikes could punch through metal that would have turned aside sword cuts or even direct hammer blows. The resulting wounds were notoriously difficult to treat with medieval medical techniques, leading to high mortality rates even among knights who survived the initial combat. This spike nightmare didn't just hurt you, it ensured medieval surgeons would have nightmares of their own trying to patch you up afterward. Archaeological evidence reveals the Morning Star's grim effectiveness. Skeletal remains from medieval battle sites show distinctive patterns of trauma associated with these weapons, clustered puncture wounds with massive underlying bone fractures. Medieval battlefield injuries could often be identified by weapon type, with Morning Star victims being perhaps the only soldiers in history who died from an acute case of too many holes. The Morning Star didn't just kill, it left a calling card that archaeologists could identify centuries later. The Morning Star required less technical skill than weapons like the sword or flail, but demanded considerable upper body strength to wield effectively. Military training manuals from the period recommend specific exercises to build the necessary shoulder and arm power, including practice swings with progressively heavier training versions. Once mastered, however, the Morning Star offered devastating returns on this investment of training time, particularly against well-armored opponents. The Morning Star was the medieval equivalent of that gym membership you actually use, except the results weren't just impressive biceps, but impressive body counts. Tactical applications varied across different military contexts. Mounted knights favored shorter-handled versions that could be wielded from horseback, delivering devastating overhead strikes augmented by the rider's elevated position and the horse's momentum. Infantry formations typically employed longer-shafted variants that could be swung in wide arcs to clear space around the wielder or thrust forward like impromptu spears when necessary. This versatility made the Morning Star a surprisingly adaptable nightmare, capable of ruining someone's day from multiple positions and distances. The psychological impact of facing Morning Star armed troops should not be underestimated. The weapon was particularly fear-inducing, with its distinctive profile triggering primal fears even in seasoned warriors. This psychological effect became a tactical advantage, with some military leaders deliberately positioning Morning Star wielders at the front of formations to demoralize opponents before contact was even made. Nothing says, perhaps we should reconsider this battle, quite like facing a line of soldiers carrying what appear to be medieval torture devices with handles. Variations of the Morning Star appeared across Europe and Asia, with regional designs reflecting local military traditions and manufacturing capabilities. Eastern European versions featured more numerous but shorter spikes optimized for penetrating the lighter armor common in those regions. Western European designs incorporated fewer but longer spikes, specifically engineered to defeat high-quality plate armor. The Spike Nightmare proved adaptable enough to evolve alongside armor technology, ensuring no protective gear could provide sweet dreams when facing this weapon. Religious imagery sometimes incorporated the Morning Star in unexpected ways. Medieval artwork occasionally depicts angels wielding these weapons against demons, suggesting that even divine retribution might require spiked implements. This religious association gave rise to the weapon's alternative name in some regions, the Holy Water Sprinkler, a grimly humorous reference to the blood spray produced when the weapon found its mark. Medieval humor tended toward the macabre, and nothing says, "Go with God," quite like a face full of metal spikes. These weapons offered a form of last rites that came with complementary dental work, though few patients survived to appreciate their new smile. The legacy of the Morning Star extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive silhouette became a visual shorthand for brutality in medieval artwork, appearing in depictions of hell and divine punishment. This visual association was so strong that morning stars were sometimes mounted above city gates or government buildings as warnings against lawbreaking, serving as three-dimensional symbols of authority's power to inflict punishment. While other medieval weapons might eventually be forgotten, this spiked nightmare continues to haunt our collective imagination as the definitive symbol of medieval brutality. While the Morning Star represented direct and unsubtle violence, medieval weapon designers also created more specialized tools. The bec de Corbin represented a thoughtful approach to the problem of killing armored opponents. Its name, French for raven's beak, perfectly described its most distinctive feature, a wickedly curved spike resembling a bird's beak, designed specifically to punch through plate armor with terrifying efficiency. The bec de Corbin belongs to the polearm family of weapons, those mounted on long wooden shafts to provide reach and leverage. What set this particular polearm apart was its versatile head design, which incorporated multiple weapon types into a single lethal package. On one side sat the namesake spike or beak, curved downward and tapered to a sharp point. The opposite side typically featured a hammerhead for delivering crushing blows. Many versions also included a straight spike extending from the top, allowing for thrusting attacks similar to a spear. This 3-in-1 design made the bec de Corbin the medieval equivalent of a Swiss army knife, though its functions were limited to various methods of inflicting grievous harm. Knights who carried one never had to worry about bringing the wrong tool to a fight. It was the battlefield multitasker that asked the important question, how would you prefer your armor penetrated today? Pierced, crushed, or skewered? A skilled wielder could alternate between piercing, crushing, and thrusting attacks without changing weapons, responding to different armor types and combat situations with remarkable flexibility. Medieval combat manuals describe specific techniques for each attack form, suggesting that warriors trained extensively to make full use of the weapon's versatility. The physics behind the bec de Corbin's effectiveness stemmed from simple mechanical advantage. The long wooden shaft, typically 5 to 7 feet in length, created a lever that multiplied the wielder's striking force. When that amplified force was concentrated into the small contact point of the beak or top spike, the pressure could exceed 4,000 pounds per square inch, more than enough to penetrate even the finest plate armor. For context, modern ballistic tests have shown that most medieval plate armor could withstand pressures of around 2,000 pounds per square inch before failing. The distinctive sound was made when a bec de Corbin punched through plate armor, a high-pitched screech followed by a dull thud as the spike penetrated the underlying body. Some military chroniclers noted that experienced soldiers could distinguish this sound on the battlefield and recognized it as a particularly bad omen for the recipient. When you heard that noise, someone had just received a special delivery courtesy of the Raven's Beak Postal Service. No signature required, delivery confirmed. Training with the bec de Corbin demanded more technical skill than many other medieval weapons. The weapon's weight distribution made it unwieldy for beginners, requiring months of practice to master. Military treatises from the period recommend specific progressive training regimens, beginning with basic strikes against stationary targets and advancing to complex combination attacks against moving opponents. Knights who mastered these techniques became particularly feared on the battlefield, able to defeat heavily armored opponents who might have been nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. The bec de Corbin found particular favor among foot soldiers tasked with fighting mounted knights. The weapon's length allowed infantry to strike riders from a relatively safe distance, while the specialized head design could either unseat the knight or deliver fatal blows through armor. Military records from several major late medieval battles credit infantry armed with these weapons for defeating previously dominant heavy cavalry forces. The Battle of Courtrai in 1302 saw Flemish infantry armed with similar polearms defeat the elite French heavy cavalry, fundamentally changing medieval warfare by proving that well-equipped foot soldiers could overcome mounted knights. Manufacturing a quality bec de Corbin required collaboration between specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths forged the complex head, carefully hardening the striking surfaces while maintaining enough flexibility in the socket to prevent breaking under impact. Woodworkers selected ash or oak shafts, paying careful attention to the grain pattern to ensure the pole could withstand the tremendous forces involved in combat. The joining of head to shaft represented a particularly critical manufacturing step, with high-quality examples featuring reinforced sockets and additional strapping to prevent separation during use. The distinctive silhouette, particularly the curved beak, created an ominous impression even before combat began. The intimidating sight of infantry formations bristling with these weapons, their curved beaks catching the light like rows of predatory birds waiting to strike. For knights who had spent fortunes on armor they believed would protect them, the sight of weapons specifically designed to defeat that protection proved particularly demoralizing. It was like watching someone approach your brand new state-of-the-art security door with the exact specialized key you were told didn't exist. All that money spent on armor, and these infantry soldiers were walking around with what amounted to Knight Can Openers Special Edition. Regional variations of the bec de Corbin reflected different military traditions and tactical needs. Italian versions typically featured longer, more slender beaks optimized for penetrating the high-quality plate armor produced in Milan and other Italian manufacturing centers. French designs often incorporated broader hammer faces, creating a better balance between piercing and crushing capabilities. Eastern European variants sometimes included additional hooks or tines, allowing the weapon to be used for disarming opponents or pulling riders from horseback. The weapon remained in active military use for an impressively long period, with documented battlefield deployments spanning from the late 13th century through the early 16th century. This longevity speaks to its fundamental effectiveness against armored opponents, even as armor design continuously evolved in response to such weapons. The ongoing arms race between armor and anti-armor weapons drove innovation on both sides, with each new defensive improvement spurring corresponding offensive adjustments. The legacy of the bec de Corbin extends beyond its battlefield use. The distinctive head design influenced later polearm development, with elements appearing in weapons used well into the age of firearms. Modern tactical entry tools used by law enforcement and military forces incorporate similar design principles, particularly in breaching tools that combine piercing, prying, and striking functions in single implements. The fundamental concept, a versatile weapon head mounted on a leverage-enhancing shaft, proved so effective that its core principles remain relevant in specialized equipment today. While the bec de Corbin represented the height of hand-to-hand anti-armor technology, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons that could deliver death from much greater distances. The ballista marked humanity's first serious attempt to solve warfare's oldest problem: how to kill people who are inconveniently far away. While the bec de Corbin allowed warriors to strike armored opponents at arm's length, the ballista extended that reach to hundreds of yards. This massive weapon essentially scaled up the humble crossbow to terrifying proportions, creating a siege engine capable of punching through multiple armored soldiers with a single shot. At its core, the ballista operated on a simple principle: store energy in twisted skeins of animal sinew or rope, then release it explosively to propel a large projectile. The resulting weapon could launch bolts weighing up to 26 pounds at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. These projectiles carried enough momentum to penetrate shields, armor, and multiple bodies in a single shot. Unlike arrows that rained down in predictable arcs, ballista bolts traveled in relatively flat trajectories at speeds too fast for the human eye to track effectively. Soldiers described the terrifying experience of watching comrades suddenly impaled by massive bolts that seemed to materialize without warning. This invisible death from afar created a unique form of battlefield anxiety. You might survive a sword fight through skill, but avoiding a ballista bolt came down to nothing but luck. Medieval troops called this God's dice, though the deity they referenced likely wasn't the one they prayed to on Sundays. Operating a ballista required specialized training and typically a crew of at least 3 to 5 soldiers. One soldier aimed the weapon, while others managed the winding mechanism that tensioned the skein. A well-trained crew could achieve firing rates of 2 to 3 shots per minute. Not rapid fire by modern standards, but fast enough to create havoc in tightly packed formations. These crews developed their own specialized vocabulary and techniques, becoming highly valued specialists within medieval armies. Their status reflected a harsh battlefield truth. A single well-placed ballista could inflict more casualties than dozens of conventional fighters. Size variations existed throughout the medieval period, ranging from cart-mounted versions that required just 2 crew members to massive fixed emplacements demanding teams of 8 or more. The largest documented examples could launch projectiles weighing over 100 pounds, though these behemoths typically fired stones rather than bolts and functioned more like artillery than oversized crossbows. These larger variants stayed in active military use well into the age of early firearms, proving effective long after many other medieval weapons had been relegated to museum displays. The ballista represented an early form of force multiplication, allowing a small number of soldiers to project lethal power far beyond their individual capabilities. While impressive in its range and penetrating power, the ballista still focused primarily on targeting individual soldiers or small groups. Medieval military engineers, however, were just getting started with their long-distance killing innovations. The Scorpion earned its name honestly, quick, deadly, and with a sting you never saw coming. While the ballista excelled at penetrating multiple targets with massive bolts, the Scorpion prioritized speed and accuracy over raw power. This lighter, more mobile torsion weapon could be repositioned quickly on the battlefield, allowing medieval armies to respond to developing threats with precisely targeted death from distances that seemed almost magical to medieval soldiers. Originally developed by Roman engineers, the Scorpion disappeared during the early medieval period, only to be rediscovered and improved upon during the Crusades. The weapon's key innovation lay in its dual torsion bundles, twisted skeins of animal sinew or human hair that stored tremendous energy. When released, these bundles propelled a dart-like projectile with enough force to penetrate shields and armor at ranges exceeding 400 yards. Medieval armies basically rediscovered that you can solve most military problems by finding new ways to hurl pointy objects at your enemies really, really fast. The Scorpion was just particularly good at making sure those pointy objects reached exactly the right person at the wrong time in their day. What made the Scorpion particularly feared was its accuracy. Skilled operators could target specific individuals on the battlefield, making it the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. Medieval soldiers quickly learned to fear these weapons, as death could come without warning from an enemy too distant to even identify clearly. One moment you'd be shouting orders to your troops, the next moment explaining yourself at the pearly gates with a large hole where your previous career plans used to be. A well-trained Scorpion team achieved remarkable firing rates, up to 10 bolts per minute, in the hands of elite operators. This combination of rate of fire, accuracy, and penetrating power made the Scorpion disproportionately influential on the battlefield. Military historians estimate that during the Siege of Acre in 1191, fewer than 30 Scorpion teams accounted for over 800 casualties among the defending forces. The defenders' morning roll call became less about who was present and more about who hadn't been ventilated overnight. The psychological impact extended beyond the casualties inflicted. Defenders forced to man walls under Scorpion fire suffered severe morale problems. The knowledge that at any moment an unseen projectile could end your life created what medieval chronicles described as the waiting death, a paralyzing anxiety that undermined defensive efforts more effectively than direct attacks. This psychological warfare aspect made the Scorpion a valuable siege weapon even when its physical damage to structures remained limited. Some besieged cities even reported cases of scorpion fever, a nervous condition where defenders constantly ducked at shadows and flinched at every sound. Nothing ruins your concentration quite like wondering if your head is about to become the next pincushion for a projectile fired by someone who might be enjoying lunch while they shoot at you. While the Scorpion brought precision death from unprecedented distances, medieval military engineers were simultaneously developing weapons of truly massive destructive potential. If medieval siege weaponry had a royal family, the trebuchet would sit on the throne. This colossal engine of destruction represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-gunpowder artillery, capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over incredible distances with devastating effect. Where the Scorpion killed with precision, the trebuchet killed with raw, overwhelming force. The trebuchet operated on a counterweight system that would make any physics teacher proud. A massive weight, often exceeding 7,000 pounds, hung from the short end of a long wooden arm. When this weight dropped, it forced the longer end of the arm upward at tremendous speed, launching whatever projectile happened to be loaded in its sling. This simple mechanism could propel a 200-pound stone over 300 meters with enough force to shatter castle walls upon impact. Castle architects who thought they'd built impenetrable fortifications discovered the hard way that their unbreakable walls were merely not yet broken. The trebuchet had a way of transforming even the most confident castle defender into an anxious house hunter. Medieval engineering reached its zenith in these massive weapons. The largest documented trebuchets required teams of up to 60 men to operate and could launch projectiles weighing over 300 pounds. Contemporary accounts describe the earth-shaking impact of these massive stones, with one chronicler noting that a direct hit on a tower reduced it to dust and splinters as if it had never existed. Castle dwellers learned to dread the distinctive creaking sound of a trebuchet being winched back. It was the medieval equivalent of hearing a bomb bay door opening directly above your home. Trebuchet ammunition showed medieval creativity at its most disturbingly innovative. While stones remained the standard projectile, besieging armies often got creative when psychological warfare seemed advantageous. Historical records document trebuchets launching diseased animal carcasses, severed human heads, and even live prisoners into besieged cities. One particularly notorious incident during the siege of Kaffa in 1347 involved catapulting plague victims over the walls, possibly contributing to the spread of the Black Death into Europe. Medieval biological warfare lacked subtlety, but certainly made an impression. Nothing says surrender now quite like having your neighbor's deceased relative raining down from the sky. The exceptional range and power of these weapons transformed siege warfare. Before the trebuchet, defenders behind strong walls could reasonably expect to outlast most besiegers. After its introduction, no wall was truly safe, no fortress truly secure. This psychological advantage often proved as valuable as the physical damage inflicted, with many cities surrendering at the mere sight of trebuchets being assembled outside their walls. When your enemy started building what looked like an enormous wooden middle finger pointed at your fortifications, it was usually time to reconsider your life choices. While these 10 weapons represent the height of medieval military technology, they also reveal how human ingenuity has always found expression even in the art of warfare. From simple clubs with spikes to massive engines of destruction, the evolution of these weapons tells a story of innovation driven by one of humanity's oldest and darkest activities.